Hello, Marcy.
Hi, Dee.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Umbrella Rebellion. I am going to go ahead and play our intro for those that might be new to the channel, and then we'll get into it.
Welcome to Umbrella Rebellion. I'm Marcy.
And I'm Dee.
We are finding healing after leaving a cult.
We will be discussing abuse and personal experience with the ATI, IBLP, and fundamental churches.
Trigger warning. This podcast may contain descriptions of various forms of abuse. Please take care for your safety and well-being while you are listening.
If the content becomes too much for you to handle, please turn this off. We hope to expose harmful teachings that lead to and justify abuse,
with the hope that those that are experiencing abuse can find support and escape from it.
Well, hello, everybody. We are so excited that y'all are here for the second part of this episode. And we are going to just jump right in and welcome our special guest. We have a psychotherapist and certified sex therapist, Marc Prevette. Welcome, Marc.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Oh, you're welcome. The conversation last month was just so good, and we didn't get to all of the questions and the topics that all of the people from the survivor groups wanted to talk about. So we just couldn't resist having you back on.
Yeah, I love it. So yeah, I'm anytime, please. Yeah.
Awesome. So if y'all haven't watched the previous episode with Marc, it is on our YouTube and on Facebook. We talked about purity culture and sexuality and healing from the teachings of the cult and how that affected our relationships romantically and otherwise. And we're going to dive right back into that topic tonight. And if you're in the live and you have any questions or comments or would like to ask Marc anything, you can go ahead and comment away and we'll try to get to them. So, as far as like what we kind of talked about last week, we got into some really, really heavy and good topics. And we kind of started with just talking about the different types of feelings that survivors can deal with when they leave the cult and they're now trying to figure out what they believe and where they stand on their sexuality and what's right and wrong for them. So a lot of us and a lot of the people in the group, these were the common things that they shared that they struggled with, and I've struggled with some of these. I'm sure Marcy, you as well. So the guilt, the shame,
Oh yeah.
distrust of yourself and your instincts, trying to figure out, what kind of dress is modest or what kind of dress that you are comfortable in, right? We all struggled with that coming out. Just having shame about who you are as a woman. A lot of us females have, had struggles with that. Um, that purity equated to our value as women, and I'm sure that some men have experienced that as well.
Mhm.
How sexual repression affects the development and a person's sense of self and normality of sexuality. Effects on future relationships, how that purity culture teachings has kind of helped in the struggle of finding normality in a relationship, right? Then a lot of our survivors are 20 somethings, early to mid 20s when they're leaving the cult, and so entering a world that is steeped in the dating culture when you haven't been in it and trying to navigate through that can be really, really difficult. Lack of personal boundaries, not knowing how to set them, that they're acceptable to set, or when you shouldn't. Um, a lot of people struggle with being unable to find joy or pleasure in sex because they were repressed for so long, and the guilt and shame kind of interferes with that, or trauma associated with sexual experiences. Lack of knowledge of your anatomy. A lot of us didn't learn actual anatomy in our schooling, right? And I think that actually goes for even outside of the cult. It's not so uncommon for, even people who weren't raised in the cult to not necessarily know their anatomy. It's just our culture doesn't really talk about sex a whole lot. It's even worse in the cult, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Non-existent. Yeah.
So the hypocrisy of the purity culture, just how they are hypersexualize everything, but then tell you not to think about sex, right? Like, meh. Um, Guilt about masturbating and exploring your sexuality. And then sometimes you have the extremes where when you leave the cult, you have hypersexual people or people who have no interest in it at all. So those are just a lot of things that we noticed our survivors talking about, things that we've experienced ourselves, feelings that are normal in this process of evolution outside of the cult. Um, so let's dive into the topics. We weren't able to get to all of them last week, and we covered a bunch. So if you weren't here, I'm not last week, but last month.
Yeah.
So if you
Really?
weren't here and you want to catch up, go ahead and listen after this and get all caught up. But it was a really good one. So the first topic we can discuss is communicating. What um trying to figure out how to communicate when, as especially for women in the cult, where we weren't valued in our communication, and trying to figure out how to communicate with a partner in an intimate setting to where you feel heard and you also get to, explore new things in a safe and healthy way. Mark, when it comes to communication in a new relationship or even an established relationship, what are some things that you would suggest just to try and, I guess, get out of that mindset of, especially for cult survivors, in high religious, control groups, of voicing your opinion in those intimate settings?
So communication, period, seems to be some difficulties, especially with a lot of women that I've worked with and couples I've worked with. But yeah, definitely in elements where we're looking at repressive elements, it's even more so where you're having this message that the woman's job is to serve the men that she's associated with, and uh, so part of, I mean, one of the very first things I usually recommend is you have to view that your voice has weight, that it matters,
Mhm,
that you have every right to state what your thoughts and feelings are. And that's like the very first hurdle, because if you don't get past that point, then it's very hard for you to kind of go, well, what do what do I say? How do I do this? How do I frame it? And but that's part of the problem, is we don't know how to learn on. First you have to unlearn it. That's the big thing.
mhm,
um,
Mhm.
you have to unlearn it, then you have to learn a new way of doing it, and then you've got to have that encouragement to continue to go that way. And a lot of times the way I describe it, it's like moving a riverbed.
mm, mhm,
So when we do that, we first have to build that. I mean, like if we look at it from a neurostructure too, you have to build this new bed, and then after you build it, you have to, go ahead and start having that water go through. Then you have to block the old path. Well, the problem is that water is always going to, for some reason, knows where to go.
mhm,
So you got to wait for it to fill up with detritus and stuff. But the problem also runs into when we get so overwhelmed and everything, we want to go down that old pathway. So it's staying in that track. The other thing I kind of say is, if for some reason you start going down that don't punish yourself
Mm.
for going down that old path. Accept what's going on, understand that you're overwhelmed, take a minute, breathe, and go back to your new path. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a struggle. The other thing that really helps is having a good support system, having a partner who understands and wants to listen. Definitely support structure is the big thing. It's huge. Because a lot of times, even when you leave a toxic relationship, you're more prone to go down those things because part of us are trained that way.
Yeah.
So that's
familiar. It's familiar. So we seek out what's familiar, and we don't realize that we're seeking out the same things. And so I liked how you were saying like the riverbed, and it made me think about the neuro pathways. And all of the survivors have had their neuro pathways ingrained in this certain thought process. I mean, even still today, there are times where I'm like, oh God, that was cult speak. Like it just comes out, right? So, and I really like that thought of you have to retrain your brain to think differently. And and now my brain just went back to a cult thought of, taking every thought captive. It's like, okay, that thought is not, nope, we're not going there. We're going to throw that out. And it's just like assessing, okay, are these my thoughts or are these cult thoughts? Or is this my thought or is this a thought that somebody told me I should think? And
Right.
it's kind of like going through every little step of that process thinking, okay, we were taught this. Do I still believe this? And if I don't, what do I believe? And it's okay for you not to know, right? And just try it. Okay, well, I don't believe that. So let's see where we can go with that's not right. Let's see where else we can find, what else we can find that maybe will fit where I feel like I am now, right? So that's kind of the retraining of those pathways.
Yes, and not the other big one is not punishing yourself if you accidentally slip into that, because a lot of times, depending on where you're at in that process, you're trained that way, and those pathways. You have to remember, we develop coping skills to survive certain situations, and because we develop those coping skills, and they've worked typically for such a long period of time, to change those coping strategies is very difficult because that's what we learn to survive with. So it's little changes as we go through, because you're basically telling your instincts that they're wrong.
Right.
It feels scary. It feels scary to let go of it because it kept you safe before. So your brain wants to stay there. I would say that when I was trying to change patterns of behavior coming out of the trauma, that my first clue that I might maybe be making a little bit of headway was that I started noticing when I was doing it. So I wasn't just doing it automatically. I could see it happening. I couldn't stop it all the time.
No.
And that's where he's saying, where I like where you're saying, be gentle with yourself and forgive yourself for those moments. But multiple people told me in those moments, um, this is progress. Just that the fact that your brain is seeing it now
Yeah.
and you're not just blind to it anymore,
Yes.
that's progress. And keep going that way. And slowly but surely I could get there. So I might notice it every third time. And then I would notice it every second time. And then I would notice it every time, but I couldn't necessarily change the behavior. And then I started being able to shift to change. So it's a slow process, but that kind of like the river, you got to just,
You
do that.
you got to take the time. You got to make the pace. And the biggest thing is you should not punish yourself if you accidentally slip back, especially in early stages. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Be kind to yourself. I love that. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess a lot of the component of communication is being in a place and in a relationship where you feel free and safe to communicate. And if that's not the case, taking steps to get there, whether it be through therapy, whether it be through changing the dynamic of your relationship, having those tough conversations of, this is where I am. This is what I want to be. This is where I want to go. Can you come along with me? Right. And, it's kind of one of the reasons I was single for a while after I got divorced is because my life was a mess. And it's like, I don't want anybody to have to come through this with me. And I also wanted to figure out who I was, right? And for any of you who are out there who are single, post cult, post getting out of the high control group, spend some time getting to know yourself before you jump into relationships.
Yeah.
You are much more prone to getting hurt or abused the same way you were if you don't have that sturdy foundation. And then work on your communication skills in smaller relationships and friendships and, parent relationships and sibling relationships. Get those muscles working. We don't always have the luxury of doing things slowly. But if you can, that's my suggestion. And if you're in the midst of, a toxic relationship and you want to change things, you have the power to do that too. So just all depends on where you're at and where you want to be.
And the other thing I'd add is a lot of times in situations like this, codependency is taught.
Yep.
And then reinforced. So you're having to fight that codependency. Because a lot of times they keep telling you, you can't make it without me, or you can't make it without this community. And a lot of times some people are drawn back in because they start off, they hit that roadblock, and they're like going, oh my goodness, they were right.
They said this was going to happen. They said that I was going to have struggles. They said that, I was going to find judgment. No, life just sucks sometimes.
Yeah.
All right, that's a good one. So another topic that kind of came up was feeling that you had no value if you lost your virginity, whether it be consensual or not, and that sexual sin was always the fault of the woman, and kind of like, I guess, trying to, work through the feeling of guilt for or shame that you have associated with your value being placed on a arbitrary concept, which we kind of discussed last episode, of that virginity is an arbitrary concept. It has, so many different meanings for so many different people. Where is the line? A lot of people draw it differently. So if there's an arbitrary line, can there really be any value in it? That's kind of my take on it.
Correct. Because a lot of times so going back to the first one, the element where you were saying that, a woman's value goes back to, because after the first one, I was like, I rebrushed up, and it goes back to that original biblical teaching of Adam and Eve, and that whole element that she was created just to service, that element and that framework. And then, so you have this servitude element brought in. Then and that's if we're looking at traditional Christianity type Judeo-Christian belief system. But then you also have the element where you're bringing in this whole element of purity and what is virginity, especially when it comes to female genitalia. And the test and true method for a long time was that whole, the hymen, and, is it there? Well, there was a lot of individuals whose hymens were, they just sat wrong, or they didn't have one. And then there's those lucky individuals whose hymens are they just rebound back, and it looks like they're always based on that mentality. And then there's some that are so dense and thick that they're required some type of surgical method to get through. So yeah, that was the arbitrarial. But then the thing is what when you look at it, what is it really? And Is it just the amount of experience? Well, I know people who've had tons of sex and have zero expertise or in it.
Mm-hmm.
They're just bumbling along kind of deal. And I've known some who, unfortunately watched a lot of porn, and they're like sexperts now. They're kind of like, oh yeah, because all porn really does is give you a good indication of what goes where. That's about it. So yeah, and not even effectively half the time. Anyway, that's a whole different discussion.
Right, that's a whole episode on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so so it's very arbitrarial. It's a lot of times based on individual or cultural expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And then I always go back to the whole indicator of what does that virginity really mean? And because the old definition of virginity is having penis and vaginal sex. So you had this whole, there was a musical group, comedy group that had this whole thing called the loophole. And that was about, and so, so it's all subjective. It really is.
Right, and just not equating your value to an arbitrary idea or something that someone else has defined for you. I think that is very, very important in our recovery, is
Yes.
defining things for yourself and finding value in yourself where you feel your value is. It's not somebody else's value that you need to worry about. You need to worry about your own value and where you find value in yourself.
Yeah, because that's what it boils down to is even when I'm working with individuals who want to improve their intimate lives, the first thing we start talking about is their comfort level within themselves.
Mm-hmm.
How comfortable are you first as a person in your own body? And then we move into how you feeling comfortable emotionally. And then we go into sexual. Because if we're rediscovering that, you have to be comfortable first looking, then being within yourself, emotionally being present. Because a lot of times for some individuals, their stress level and everything keeps them so tightly wound up that they are incapable of even really enjoying the act of a sexual experience or even just general intimacy because they're so tightly wound. Because they're always worried that they're doing something wrong. So
So that kind of brings me to Mark and I were looking for ethical resources for our viewers that we can recommend. And I am going to put a link in the chat here. And this is omgyes.com.
yes.
It is, I looked at it and it has a wealth of information. There is a cost to join. It is very minimal, in my opinion, based off of things that I've seen. It's a like a one time, like I think it's like $50 or like $80, depending on which price plan you think. Somewhere in there. It's under $100 for one or the other things, but this is a way for men and women to discover things, to ethically explore sexuality in a safe environment with research based criteria. So all of their stuff was put together by doing data analysis and stuff like that and talking to experts, and it looks like an amazing thing, and one day I might delve into it.
And just to, if there is any clinicians or doctors or out there, you can help your clients / patients because the website does offer for clinical people a discounted, sometimes even free, that they can actually bring into that clinical space to kind of help with the recovery process of, and it's specifically done around the vagina and the vulva. It's specifically designed around that element of pleasure and rediscovering elements, or even discovering for the first time that. So it's not like a true, I mean, it does have a little elements of pornography, but it's more based on different elements of pleasure and discovering that and how to discover it, and even levels, because sometimes some things are too intense and they kind of say, this is how you kind of lower it down. Try this instead of that. And so there's a lot of resources built into that.
So it's educational porn.
It's
Yes.
it's very
Yes.
and some of it is digital, it's like drawn image, artistic drawn images, kind of showing things. So
Oh,
it's
okay,
not
like
all about,
caricatures. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
it's not all about having models. Sometimes it is diagrams and stuff like that as well.
Okay.
So yeah.
So
very-
yeah, I wasn't able to dive. I did a few I watched a few videos and like the introductory and stuff, and I was like, wow, this looks pretty ethical for you to explore some things. There are many, many, many resources that you could find for free.
Yeah.
Don't know that I would recommend them here. But you know, you do you, boo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I always,
It's better than a book at the library, which is how I did it.
or have a
I
book
put a book behind the book that I was reading so that I could figure things out.
Yeah.
So then nobody would know what I was doing. So that's better and more scientific, I'm sure.
Oh, and they're, when I looked at it recently, they're always doing more research. They're exploring more elements like that, and
Awesome.
there's also a lot of other groups. And I mean, one of the most common ones that people are aware of is the Kinsey Institution, that's based out of I think it's the University of Indiana or Indiana University. I always get it confused, but yeah, there are another one, Masters and Johnson. Yeah, so there's a few out there that do ethical research-based sexual research.
So, and another one that I think might be more like closer to people who are just getting out is Bare Marriage, Bare Marriage podcast. Sheila Ray Gregory, I think is what her name is. Uh, so she compiled, she essentially did the data collection within the Christian community. So all of her data is based on what we just came out of or what we're getting out of, right? And so it's very faith-based. She takes, like, I was watching her, they unfortunately they had their page on Facebook hacked, and so they had to change they had to get a new one. So she's like starting from scratch. So if y'all are on Facebook and y'all were following Bare Marriage and you don't see them anymore, they had to create a new page. It is called Bare Marriage. And she takes some of the like books. I don't remember what one she had today, but she essentially takes an excerpt from it and corrects it.
I like that. Well done.
Yeah, so makes it more ethical and scientific and
Yeah.
appropriate. So oh, thank you so much, Eagle Eye. I appreciate that. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you. All right, so our next topic is a doozy.
Okay.
Self-control. Self-control was not taught to, in my opinion and in my experience,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, to any of the males in fundamentalist sects. I mean, any sect of it, Baptist, you know, any of the religions, IBLP, IFB, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It was not taught that they are responsible for controlling their own urges. It was taught that they should avert their eyes and that it was the women who were leading them astray in those thoughts and that they needed to protect themselves from the Jezebels of the world. So with that, it was often taught that a man was entitled to sex and that he had a need for sex, and a wife was not allowed to deny her husband sex because that would lead to all kinds of things like adultery and porn addiction and, all of the sins. Because if you don't pleasure your husband, obviously he has no choice but to sin.
Yeah. I'm just gonna say it's a bunch of just hilarchy. It's just
Malarkey?
hilarchy. It's just a bunch of hilarchy. Yeah. So the easiest thing I can say is, and this is what I usually go with, is consent. The only thing that's yes is a yes. And anything else is a no. Even that, I guess so. Oh, I guess if you really. And I think the funniest thing I've ever heard, and I've heard this since like watching TV, as a running joke is, if I don't get it, I'm going to die. If that was the case, the human race would have died out so long ago.
Right.
Oh my Lord. Yeah, it's like, really? Okie
Yeah.
dokie.
When I was a teenager, they always like to say they're going to get blue balls. That's not a thing.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, you can go into the restroom and take care of it in 1 minute, and that goes away like that. So,
right. It's not the responsibility of the other person to take care of your needs if they are not in the mood, if they are not feeling it, if they are sick, if they are not feeling well. All of those things, you matter as a woman in this situation. And, I'm going to say also to the men, you matter too. If you're not in the mood and your wife wants it and you don't, you can say no.
right, which goes back to
Consent
consent.
goes both ways.
Back to consent.
Yeah, the other one, I when I'm working with couples and they're learning to reconnect, arousal does not equal consent. Just because there's lubrication, just because there's an erection or some engorgement of an erogenous zone does not mean that sex is on the table. So even when one of the techniques I utilize, and a lot of us people who are in my field do, is sensate work. Not all of us, but a lot of us do sensate work. And one of the ways I work up to it is discovering these different areas first, where we start off, what messages are you sending? What messages are you receiving? And we work our way up towards, more intimate levels. We start off with no erogenous, at least where I do, no erogenous zones, no sexual zones, no erogenous zones, nothing. Relay. And I would strongly suggest anyone who's thinking about looking into that topic, make sure you're working with someone who has some training in it, because while there's a lot of self-help books out there, sometimes we're not always a good judge of our own limits. Or being objective, or sometimes if we're working with our partner, we get this rush of endorphins and we're thinking, oh yeah, we can go ahead and skip to this next part because we're doing so well here. Yeah, I get it, but at the same time, sometimes
you kind of almost need a third party to like help you navigate some of that if it's unfamiliar territory, to be like, okay, y'all did this was your reaction, let's process what happened here.
Right. And we don't always know what the issue is, the underlying issue. So that's where having that person who is a little bit better trained and can be a little bit more objective, whether that's a therapist or a sex educator or counselor, depending on what it is, that someone who can kind of help with that pacing, because whatever your fundamental underlying current is. So if we're dealing with someone who comes from more of a cult-like behavior or purity culture element, it's very easy to remember that, like, we started the old pathway. that impulse control might still not be fully where you need it to be. So that's the other thing is understanding from a space of objectivity is sometimes needed.
Yeah, and I would say that, just being able to understand where you are with all of that as well is so important before you start delving into that, right? But sometimes you have to have, some expert exploration with your partner, to understand fully where you are, but then also having the safety to be like, nope, there yet, and if that's something that you do struggle with in your relationship, having a third party to discuss those things who isn't emotionally connected to it, who hasn't had it ingrained in their brain that, or if they did, they could look at it more clinically, that are entitled. One person is entitled and one person is, what is that word I'm looking for?
One is entitled and the other one is subjected or just has to deal with it.
Expected to comply.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was another word I was looking for, but I can't find it. It's buried in the brain somewhere.
Oh yeah. Before you know it.
So, just trying to get out of those dynamics of those, I guess, gender roles that we were taught for so long, and branching outside of that and owning your own body and being comfortable with your own body and being able to express what you feel to your partner. It's all a process. It's a very long process.
Yeah.
I would say expressing yourself in that realm might be hard because I know for me that any words that had anything to do with a sexual experience or anything even remotely attached to it weren't even allowed. Like I didn't even have the vocabulary to say it, first of all. And secondly, when I did, I felt great shame just even saying the word, much less anything else. So that might be a struggle too, is just being able to actually get it to come out of your mouth to tell your partner what to explain yourself or to make a request or to work through that type
To
of thing.
name body parts can be very hard for survivors, right? To
Yes.
name sexual
Anatomy.
acts could be hard.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you don't know what it's called, or there's shame in saying the word. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
So, so for me with the self-control for the males, understanding that that was a false teaching and coming to the realization that what someone else thought or did about me was not a reflection of who I was or my value, right? And that was a very long process of slowly working to that, of being able to say that about myself, being able to think that, being able to own that as truth. And we kind of talked about this in the last episode of like unwanted advances, catcalling and stuff like that. That is not a reflection on, how you dressed, how you walked, what you spoke, how you spoke to people. That people who do inappropriate things is about them, not about
Reflection on them.
you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's funny you brought that up because we got onto an old episode of watching back to 80s TV, and my wife and daughter were watching Designing Women, and they had that episode where there was catcalling and stuff. And when the mothers and wives were brought in, how quickly they changed. So it's like, yeah, no, it's not.
It's not about you, it's about that person, and they will quickly change if they have accountability in a negative way. Like, yeah, if they're reinforced by their buddies, but their moms and their wives comes in and they change, obviously it's not about you, right?
Yeah. And it's about their needs, and it's about them feeling that they are, at least this has been my experience with it. It's about them feeling that they are attractive and that they are.
Mm.
And so they're doing these things to make them feel that way.
That
And
is so true. Yeah.
so, yeah, so they have value. Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that because I think I've thought that for a long time, but I've never like equated it to that. Just like bullies, right? Insecure people will
Yeah.
bully people because they feel insecure, so they want
Yeah.
other people to feel insecure. So yeah, that makes so much sense, Mark. Thank you.
Yes, it does.
I mean, it's just
Um,
that's how I see it. And that, yeah, especially doing therapy
yeah,
for so long.
right. And sometimes it just takes one person to say the right thing to you in the right way for you to go, "Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that makes sense," because we've never heard those things before
Yeah.
in our communities, in the teachings that we were taught. We've never explored, you know, this kind of topic in an open public way. Which I think, for any of you that are out there, it's perfectly normal to talk about sex. It's all part of being human. There's no shame in it.
Mhm.
It it is part of how we continue as a human race. I mean, being comfortable talking about that. It was okay, so I have all boys. A lot of y'all know this. It was so hard for me to have those conversations with my sons.
Mhm.
But I also knew that it was so important for me to have those conversations with my sons because I did not want them to do to any woman what was done to me
Mhm.
by people who were taught wrongly about gender roles, and what's the expectation in intimate settings and stuff like that. And so I think I touched on this a little bit on the last podcast with you, Mark, teaching my boys that consent is always needed and consent can be revoked at any moment in the
Yes.
process. I don't care if you're in it for 5 minutes, you get out if she says no.
Or 5
Or
seconds.
Yep, 5
Yeah.
seconds,
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yes. It
The
doesn't matter.
word "no" gets
Any
thrown out there, that's back it out, buddy.
And the only thing I'll add on that is a lot of times also with that mentality of that men need it and men want it. For them to not want it or not need it, like you were saying earlier, is sometimes also viewed as less than manly. So if
Mhm,
they're not in the mood and they don't do it, then they automatically get other labels thrown on them
mm,
because of
mhm,
that. So they all sometimes I've had male clients who have said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." They're wanting it, and I'm just not in the mood.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
if I don't, what will they say? What will they do? I'm like, well, no is still no. Even for you, you can say no for you too, and that's
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that
I'm
I guess pressure from society and especially in religious communities of a man being a man and that he
Yeah.
always has to be the dominant one and the one that wants it all the time, like that's not a good thing for you to have learned, and it's okay for you to feel differently and to think differently, and if, just like we're talking about the women's perspective, you as a man have a right to not want it.
It's
And
just as
that's
toxic the other way.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
and sometimes also when men are really not, their bodies won't respond. Well,
Mm,
then you must not love me. You must not like me. You must
mhm,
not. Who are you seeing behind my back now?
Mhm. Yeah.
And it's probably they're like, I'm tired.
Mhm.
I had a
mhm.
long day. or I'm not feeling good, or, you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah, there's
or,
a lot of mechanics that go into arousal for both parties. And
Mhm.
so, you have to weigh out, is this a physical thing? Is this an emotional thing? Or is this a hormonal thing? Like, there's so many factors that could affect somebody's readiness and willingness to be intimate that you
Mhm,
can't just assume it's some outside source, right?
Yeah.
correct. Yeah. I just noticed in
Um,
the chat there.
Yeah, there are so many songs about men's sex drives and lusting after women that reinforce the idea that men always want sex, and if they don't want it, something is wrong. It is so emotionally unhealthy. I agree with you. As a society as a whole, that whole message is just permeated in our society and in all of the messaging. It's like I said the last episode, it's doubled down on in the Christian fundamentalist teachings. And the gender roles are doubled down and even expounded upon in the fundamentalist. And so it's kind of just like a different intensity of those normal societal things that people struggle with, but it's on a kind of a different level depending on your, experience. I mean, not gonna say that that's everybody's experience, but the vast majority of us that were in high control groups.
The old adage, sex sells.
Mhm.
So, so on that, we were talking about consent. So we have a specific question that one of our survivors had asked in the groups. How do you navigating saying no, or what is okay to negotiate, like a compromise, I guess? Like, how do you even like figure out starting that process, I guess, or establishing boundaries, right?
See, that one can be very difficult because depending on what the individual or the couple or the couple, depending on the dynamic, uh, has a lot to. Primary thing is like communication with yourself first, because if you're pre-programmed that this is what you're supposed to do, or one old saying that comes to my mind is that a vessel needs to be filled, kind of deal. That whole element, uh, understanding first what you're needing and wanting at that point, being honest first with yourself, because that can help lead you to communication with your partner. However, you run into the other obstacle if your partner is not willing to hear you.
Mhm.
So that runs into those other difficulties and elements and reinforcing element. So you first got to listen to yourself. Then you've got to be able to communicate without shame, judgment, or negativity from your partner. And then negotiation begins first with the understanding of what each other is needing and wanting from the other. And sometimes we're only taught that the way, for some of us, the only way we're taught to express affection is through sex. Well, that's definitely wrong, because there's several things in our lives that's very affectionate that has nothing to do with sex.
Mhm.
So yeah, it first comes down to being honest with yourself, finding a partner who's willing to listen, and then having that honest conversation. And there's so many skills governing around improved communication. To limit it to one would be very doing the other
Not
one some
really.
justice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too narrow focused, right? It's pretty individualized to situations.
Yeah.
What works for one person may not work for another.
Mm.
But first you have to establish the fact that in our culture and our teachings is that women, you are allowed to have boundaries and you are
Mhm.
allowed to say no. So, first and foremost, you have to get your mind wrapped around the fact that you can.
Mhm.
Um, and
Mhm.
then from there, a lot of it is experiencing something negative. you can say, okay, I don't want to do that. And then you have to communicate that, like when you do this, I feel this way, right? When you do this, I feel this. Um, Personal example, I have not in relationships been able to handle someone touching my head. Don't care if it's affectionate, don't care if it's just playing. Like playing with my hair is one thing, but like resting your hand, and you know where that comes from, Marcy, huh?
Yes.
Mhm. The blessings, the
Mhm.
blessings of your father sticking his hand on your head and praying over you. That was so triggering for me and for so long. It took me years of being with my now husband for me to be okay with it, and it didn't trigger a visceral response of wanting to throw up.
Yeah.
So, it's like in a lot of conversations that happen in those dynamics are, this is not about you, partner. This is about my experience. This is about what I experience. You are not making me feel this way. What my history is coming to the surface. It's a PTSD response in some people as well, right? You had traumatic events. This is bringing up feelings. Um, with my husband, it wasn't an intimate situation, but there was a situation in our first couple of years of us being married, and I'm like, I just lost it. I'm like, you cannot do that, and I just like lost it on him. And we came back and we had the conversation, and I'm like, this was not about you. Like, you didn't do anything wrong. I was brought back to a moment in my life where I experienced trauma, and I felt like I was in that trauma right then and right there. And so, to avoid me feeling that way, could you please not do this?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and I think a lot of it is trying to help your partner understand in those moments, whether they be intimate or not, what you are feeling and
Mhm.
why. Like, and sometimes we can't understand it. We don't know why we're experiencing this. And
Yeah.
it's okay to say, I don't know why I feel this way when you do this. Like, there must have been something that happened that caused me to feel this way when somebody did this to me. It's repressed. Who knows? I'll deal with it in therapy. But until then, let's not do this.
Yeah. Sometimes the why doesn't matter. If I don't like it, I don't
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah. Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
true. That's true.
That is so true. Why doesn't matter? I think our tendency from the fundamental background is you had to know the why. It had to be explained. It had to be justified in some way. And I find that often with me too, in any situation, with my kids or with my husband, um, that I feel like I have to justify it all the time. This is why it's valid. And I think it's because I don't think it's valid unless I prove it. And you don't have to prove it. It can be valid just the way it is.
Why is one of the words I try to avoid using in clinical practice
Mm, okay.
because it's so emotionally charged.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Why do you feel that way? Why?
I don't
Okay.
know. I just do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, depending on what the question is, you kind of reframe it. So, maybe what is it that happens when I touch you here? What is that response like? Um,
Mhm.
would there be someplace else that you would feel better with me
Mm.
touching or talking about? Or because if your partner touches you somewhere and you're like, don't touch me there. Well, why?
Yeah.
I like it. Why don't you? You know, I mean, that's an extreme element, but sometimes that's how
Right.
we hear it when we're coming from this wounded area, is when we hear why, we immediately have to defend ourselves.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And sometimes that takes us right back to
Mm.
especially if it's a trauma-based element, takes us right back to that trauma. We might not remember the facts, but we'll remember the feeling. And that can really just sort of kind of smack us. Um,
People
so
don't know how to ask open-ended fact-finding questions anymore. Everything seems to be yes, no based. I mean, yeah. There's a friend of Mark and I's that I love when she goes off on her tangent and she's like, "I will thank you for your understanding. I will not be explaining myself."
Oh yes, I love that.
Yes.
I don't need to defend myself to you, because
Mhm.
even with our partners,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it doesn't matter because
Mm-hmm.
we don't have the answer, and if they're supportive, it doesn't really matter at that point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're
Yeah.
ready,
Yeah.
they'll talk to us. So that's how it usually
Mhm.
goes.
Okay, so our next topic, because oh my gosh, we could talk all night long, and I just realized we're getting close to that hour mark, and I'm like, wait, how'd this happen?
It's okay. I'm good. Yeah.
Um,
So
so talking about bodies, right? Like the touching was very frowned upon in our culture and it was very highly discouraged, especially for opposite sex. Um, a lot of women were taught to hide their bodies, so they felt judgment about who they were. One of our survivors said that it led them to an eating disorder. And then, the woman being inferior to the man and having that, again, the value of yourself being tied to your body and what it can do, right? We kind of touched on that already. So where was I going with this? So there was a question that we had, and then I think is good to kind of pair with that was, how do you unlock the sexual repression that resulted from the purity teachings? A lot of people talked about how we weren't able to touch all during, opposite, especially opposite sex for, most of our lives. And then the minute you get married, you're expected to, as women especially, to carry out these acts, and you have absolutely no idea sometimes even what your body is supposed to do, what parts you even have, because you were not supposed to touch yourself ever. So, you know, talk to us about, I guess, starting that process of unlocking that repression and, I guess,
mm,
healing from that switch that you have to flip when you're married in this culture.
whew, wow,
I know, right?
that one's not an easy one.
Mhm.
So some individuals get lucky enough to have a same-gendered parent who will give them the heads up before their wedding night and say, just so you know, this is what it's going to go and this is how it needs to be, and just prepare yourself. And usually for the person who's on the receptive end, it's just grin and bear, it'll be over in a minute.
Mm. How many of the survivors have heard that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing I've heard quite a bit. It's just, just it's your lot. It's a
Mhm.
needed process, and it goes back to that whole thing, to that whole vessel to be filled element. So the thing that it's a very complex process, and it does require, because everyone's experience with it is so, while there's some similar veins, there's something to say for individual family practice, because this is something else I've experienced with, even within these elements of very tightly religious elements. There is sometimes the women of the group will still secretly like tell their daughters or their sisters or whoever, like, okay, we're not supposed to talk about this. No, someone watch. I'm going to tell you what you need to know to make sure this doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. This is what you need to do to protect yourself from this. And, they will kind of state, these are the things you need to kind of do, but we got to be quiet about it. Because if anyone hears about it, we will be punished.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so when you're looking at anyone coming out of those situations, it's back to that. If they're working with any type of sexual educator or therapist in these situations, we really have to take a look at those elements of where are you at, where are you wanting to be, and how can we get you to that point as safely and as healthy as possible for you. Because if I just give you that proverbial book and you look at it, you're either going to be completely overwhelmed, completely confused, or you'll look at it and go, so this is everything I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And which leads to being overwhelmed or it's some type of overcompensation sometimes. So yeah, it's one of those things that we really would have to be very, very careful, especially when we're working with any individual whose sexual identity is automatically punished or
Mm-hmm.
frowned upon in any way. So if we're looking at it from a perspective of cisgendered heterosexual women to something that's not that,
Mm-hmm.
and the level of punishment, including sometimes in some areas death, ends up happening if you do not fit this very compact. So that's why I said we have to be very, very careful in those situations to lead that person as healthy as we possibly can, depending on their individual needs. So I wish I could give you a very clear cut answer to it, but it's
Right.
difficult.
So I think it can kind of go back to our conversation about the neuropathways, the foundation of the riverbed, right? Like we have to go back to what were the thoughts that we were,
Mhm.
what were the teachings that we were taught, what is true, what do we
Mhm.
believe? Is that something that was put upon me by someone else? Do I agree with it? Do I not agree with it? And working on reconnecting new neural pathways or a new riverbank, to get from where we were to where we want to be, being kind with yourself, going slow. If, you are new to this and new to relationships, um, be be kind, be mindful. I'm not going to tell you to be demure. Uh,
Oh, loud.
mindful. I was like, wait, no, we're not going there. Um, so and just get comfortable with your own self. I mean, I can't even, like, I feel like that's kind of like a lot of the theme of this episode is being
It
comfortable with
really is.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Learning yourself, because you cannot, I don't feel like you can truly be 100% in a relationship if you don't know who
Mhm.
you are, if you don't know what
Mhm.
you like, you don't know what you don't like, your wants, your needs. And that's funny because
Yes.
I had a conversation with a teenage person, I'm not going to say who, but I was like, they were talking about their relationship and I'm like, you need to figure out what you want in a relationship, what you need in a relationship, because if not, you're only going to be fulfilling this other person's needs and wants, and you're going to downplay your needs and wants, and you're going to be left feeling unfulfilled. Um, so, I mean, that's kind of, the advice that I give to people who are exploring new relationships is number one, you have to figure out what you want, what you need.
Yep.
Um, Another reason I was single for a very long time before I met my husband was because I had absolutely no idea what I wanted or needed in a relationship, and sometimes it's trial and error. And do not be afraid to end a relationship that is not meeting your needs. And, it's okay if you end it if they're not meeting your wants too,
Yep.
and then also we are taught to rely on our partner to fulfill all our wants and needs. And it's not humanly possible.
No.
It, in in a healthy relationship, you have friendships outside of it to fill those wants and needs that your partner is incapable of doing. And I'm not talking about a romantic way, or
No.
I could be. Like if you want to explore polyamory, go ahead. If you want to explore multiple, go ahead. Do what you want, boo. It's your
Yep.
life. No judgment, But I know, like, in our community, that's really, hard to branch out from the monogamous relationship, or, the opposite sex relationships or gendered relationships, into more broad things. And there's plenty of people that who have, but
Mhm.
just continue to explore things, and find out what you like, what you don't like,
Mhm.
what you feel like, what path you want to go on. Just can't express that enough. Like, find out who you are. And it's an evolving process, right? Like, me 7 years ago, I was different than I am today with my husband. Our relationship, our dynamics are different. Our frequency of intimacy is all different. And being okay with the evolution of your relationship as well, or yourself as a sexual being, all of those things are like part of this whole, like, healing from purity culture.
Yeah, and the thing I would also kind of put a couple little spins on that is, if we look at this from a animal element, we're one of the few animals on the planet that has sex socially, not solely
Mm-hmm.
reproductive. And even in those social structures, the one thing I find very interesting for the most part, I mean, there's always exceptions to the rules on these things. The one who governs and determines when sex happens is the female, not the male. So even in those social dynamics, um, the female still is the one that governs that type of behavior. And of course, there's I could go into a whole thing on elements of sexual studies and explorations of other animals and stuff like that. But that's the one thing that we see a lot of, is the female governs that, and we don't have sex just for reproductive elements.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if we did, then we wouldn't have to worry about a lot of the stuff that we're having to face, because we would have very strong characteristics that only govern during certain times. I mean, even in animals that do, there is signs of sexual receptivity that humans do not exhibit. So, yeah, and yeah, I've heard all the arguments why and all that, but what it boils down to is, in today's society, it doesn't really matter, because if we are to evolve socially as we're trying to evolve socially, then overcoming those animalistic needs and natures needs to evolve with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right, absolutely. And we don't have to be stuck in the past. Yeah. So along those lines, a lot of our survivors experience a great deal of trauma around sexuality, whether it's, in childhood or adulthood. One of the topics that was brought up was the concept of early masturbation, like toddler or preschool age. Obviously, that was going to be dealt with harshly within our community, and further damaged people with the repression of sexual expression, right? So I guess the question was, can this be a trauma response, or like a coping mechanism if you are that young, or is it just natural to do that?
to masturbate, or
Like,
at least
yeah,
touching.
I guess they said specifically masturbation, so
Okay.
I don't know if they meant touching, their genitals,
Mhm.
or, and I don't think at that age you were able to get to orgasm, so it must have been
Go ahead.
just a sensual thing of the feeling of pleasure, right?
So right, because we're we're corrected at very early ages, depending on where we're coming from, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable behavior in polite society or religious society, however we want to kind of view it. And so when we look at, especially for us who have had very small children, especially babies, and we take that diaper off, one of the very first things they do is they put their hand down there. Why? Because it feels good for them to do that. And they don't know. I mean, if you want to look at any element that where pure innocence lies, you look at a baby. You know, they don't have these social rules and orders. It's just there. And so, and we teach, and somewhere along the line, we got this lesson that touching ourselves is wrong. And then depending on households and stuff, it can be touching ourselves in front of people or whatnot. And it just evolved. So if we look at it from that perspective, then pleasure is pleasure, whether that's, and I'm not saying, okay, we all should just go naked and just touch ourselves unwillingly fashion in front of everyone. No, it's not that.
Right.
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is masturbation wrong? If we look at these things outside of a very religious lens, and it's something we do either by ourselves or around individuals who can consent to that type of viewing, then no, it's not wrong. If we look at it from that other lens where there's some type of stopgap, then is it wrong to do it in those situations? Then possibly. Like, I'm not saying you should not go and do something in front of people that can't give consent or do not consent to seeing that. Then yeah, that's violating their agency. Mm-hmm. So, but is the act, no, and there's been shown to have health benefits to it too. It elevates mood. It can balance out endorphin levels. It can, safely explore sexuality and be able to express it in a healthy relationship because we understand how we like to be touched. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at it from those perspectives, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of good benefits to it. But when we learn this, it's definitely some research done on there that we can say in any given society or place that this is taught. Mm-hmm. So it's not wrong.
I think in the example, if I remember correctly, and if listener, if you're listening, I'm hoping I'm getting to the point of your question. Is, could it have been if they had an experience that was traumatic as a child, mm-hmm. could masturbation or touching yourself be a coping mechanism in a setting like that?
Definitely. It can go either way. It can go with that kind of element where you were talking about touching your head and it created as a visceral response. Well, it can be that way too, where they're like, oh, I can't do that. But it can also lead into this element where it kind of feeds itself. So I'm not supposed to do this, but it feels good, but I need to be punished and shamed, which adds that emotional energy, which then we want to elevate to make ourselves feel better, which this makes us feel good. So we're going to start doing it again. And so it leads into this repetitive cycle. And the one way from my clinical experience, I've seen this is when I'm dealing with someone who says, when I masturbate and I hit to orgasm, I immediately feel guilty.
Oh, wow.
And then I'm like, okay, then what happens? Well, then I want to do it again. Because we want to avoid pain. The easiest way to avoid pain is pleasure. Well, what I just did made me feel good. As soon as it balances out, I'm going to want to do it again. So we go into this cycle of it.
So it could even be trying to avoid the pain of your situation when you are a child, if it's either emotionally, physically, or sexually abusive, a child could be doing that to, I guess, drown out the abuse, right? And to feel pleasure in a way that they don't experience in their home.
Right. And sometimes they'll do it to punish themselves too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I've had that experience with as well, when it comes down to I need to punish myself. So the one way I can punish myself is to do this because I know it's wrong, and
Mm.
I need
Then
to
I'll feel bad about it because I did it. Yeah.
right. And then that gives me some way that gives me a place of a point of I know I'm a bad person because I'm doing this and because they told me this, and I don't know why I'm feeling bad any other way. So I'm going to do this to myself because this is what I've been taught that makes me feel bad or I should feel bad about. So I'm going to do it so I can have this reason to do it. And
So
that,
almost like controlling your environment
Control
and how
thing.
you
Yeah.
it's
very
a control thing of
Yeah.
I feel bad, but I'm gonna make myself feel better, but then I'm gonna make myself so because what I do is supposed to be bad, so then it's controlling your punishment. And then I think another factor, and correct me if I'm wrong here because I'm not a therapist, is when young children experience sexual trauma, they don't understand what is happening to them.
right.
And could an element of that being trying to figure that out in a, toddler or young, child, like trying to make sense of what they're experiencing?
Sometimes it
Okay.
really like it really depends on the individual, their own story, their own development. So I can't give you a hard yes or no, because sometimes with individuals who've especially been assaulted at a very early age, don't know why they're behaving the way they do.
Mhm.
Sometimes they might only have flashes of emotion or sensation that doesn't really make much sense depending on the
Mhm.
age of the assault. Sometimes the individual who was assaulted, the message they received can also change the flavor of it. Uh, However, one of the things that I have primarily noticed, and with most of the stuff I've researched too, that individuals' unresolved sexual trauma can either end up with what we classify as hyposexuality or hypersexuality. So low sex drive or high sex drive, depending on what's going on. And there's always this range. So to say
Right, right.
facts is you can't really do that. But those tends to be those divergence. Now there is some that are able to compensate very well, and that can be also a product of their environment, their education. Sometimes they might have had a older sibling or a family member that helped them realize that they weren't to blame or they weren't wrong. So to say there can be any range.
It could be any of those things, not
Correct.
necessarily is, depends
Correct.
on, yeah. So it's just like kind of like the list of, like, we went through like the list of what is physical abuse or what is spiritual abuse. It may not
Mhm.
be all of those things, but it could be some
Mhm.
of those things.
Right, and there are some also. There's always an outlier somewhere along the way,
Mhm.
but typically we see individuals that are either hyper or hypo, and it's a way of compensating for those feelings, and it also depends on the
Having control over that part of your life because you didn't have it before, whether it be you do everything that you wanna do or you do nothing, right?
Mhm.
right,
Mhm.
and the lesson too.
Mhm.
Going back to what men are supposed to want this and women are supposed to give it,
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
and then when we're looking at those other gender identities or sexual identities, the confusion just keeps ramping up. And then when you deal with people who don't want to be in romantic relationships, but they want the sex, there's that element too. So we have this whole plethora of things out there. But what always boils down to, and you're probably going to get tired of hearing me saying it, is when we have someone that comes in like this, it's definitely necessary to have someone that has some type of experience to be objective.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's not a therapist, because some people don't trust therapists. And I understand that. So they might go to a person they trust or an educator. And sometimes there are religious leaders out there that are very, that going back to that more cult, they're more open and welcoming and more diverse, and they're less judgment focused. And so they might be the right one to go to too. So, and I know that's depending on the faith system, it's kind of a little bit more narrow to find those, but they do exist. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we're an hour and 20 minutes in, and we have that big bombshell of a question that we had talked about. And I know we can go on and on about this. Just want to check before we delve into this topic. Are y'all okay for at least another 20 minutes?
I am, if Marcy is.
Are you good, Marcy? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So here's the doozy, the end to be all question for the night.
Yes.
What can be the cause for lack of orgasm?
Okay, so we're going to concentrate just on the one that we've been focusing on. So when it comes to cisgendered women having difficulties reaching it, because like we said, I told you earlier, I could literally go 3, 4, 5 hours easily just on this topic. So we'll go
it's
first.
Cliff Notes version.
Yes. So I'm going to
give us a nutshell.
Yes. So let's go with the first and foremost. Not every vulva owner is going to experience orgasm through penetrative sex. And that's because of several different reasons. If we look at it from an anatomy function, sometimes the primary sexual organ in the vulva is the clitoris. And sometimes the clitoris does not get enough stimulation during penetrative sex to help with that sensation. Now, to be fair, the clitoris is a lot bigger than people see. Most people just see that little tip, but it actually looks like a wishbone. It goes from the tip down and a little bit into the vaginal canal. But the majority of the sensory organs are at what they see under the clitoral hood. That's the majority. So it doesn't get enough stimulation, which means they are not capable or have very difficult time achieving orgasm through penetrative sex. Then physiological, that's that. Then if we look
anatomical is the first one, right? Yeah.
Correct. Yes, that's the easiest one to see. And as I said, we could go on about a lot of different elements to that. Then we go into the one that probably means a lot more to especially this form, and that is dealing with the self-esteem and the emotionality of it. So one of the things that necessarily needs to kind of happen for the typical female orgasm to occur is an element of relaxation and comfort for them to relax a little bit to accept the experience. And if they are not in that state, I've had clients who say, I've only been able to have orgasm when I have had a few drinks. Well, it's because you're relaxed. They have to be in that more relaxed state to be able to even accept what they're receiving. Now, it's not just penetrative sex. I've seen that even with elements where they're self-pleasuring and they can't do that. It's because they're not relaxed enough to accept what's being done. So if we want to cut it into this nice little twofer nutshell, it's usually one of those two main factors, but there are, it can be a combination of the two. It could be other types of physiological elements that could prevent it, that has nothing to do with pleasure. It could sometimes not enough lubrication, age. I mean, I could literally go through a checklist of things.
It could be hormones. It could be pelvic floor dysfunction. It could be let's see,
age.
what was the age, right?
Yes,
Hormones
age.
and age, or
Yeah.
you could just not be interested in it and
Yes.
not
Much.
feeling it.
No. Lack of trust in your partner is another big one. So yeah, like
right.
Yeah. So we could.
Without trust, I mean, can you relax enough to enjoy the moment? I would say for the men that are out there, you don't go and drain all the oil out of an engine and start it. So you want to make sure that you give the engine all of the attention it needs before you ask it to perform.
Yep.
You lubricate it well. You know, and I hate to equate a woman to a car because that's always an often correlation, but
Yeah.
it's what some
analogy.
men can understand, right?
The way I usually explain it is, because for some reason runs well. Women are like Model A's and men are like Formula One race cars. Usually with the old Model A's, you got to get out and you got to crank it to get it going. But once it goes, it can keep going. Whereas a Formula One race car, that's it. It goes from start to a quarter mile down the road, done. Yeah. So not every person's like, but that's how I usually explain it. It fits in that brain. I do have a slightly more vulgar way of saying things, but I'm ex-military.
This
So,
podcast, we're gonna avoid that.
Yes, because
we don't want to scare all our listeners off.
Yeah. So it's that's how I usually explain it in the clinical setting. Is if you want a way of looking at it, it is that you're going to have to spend a little bit more time outside of the vehicle to get it running and get it going. But once it's going, it's going to go a while. Whereas the other tends to be you push a button, go, done. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I kind of remind people is if we look at sex as just the function of reproduction, the anatomy of the vaginal canal is to induce male orgasm for reproductive elements. It doesn't mean that's its sole function, because it's also the birth canal. It is also a sense of pleasure. It's also a sense of health, to keep things maintenance wise. So, and to really push the element, the clitoris is the only organ in any part, male, female, other body, that is solely built for pleasure. Solely. That's its only purpose, pleasure. And it has more nerve.
All of you fundamentals out there that think that women should not have pleasure with sex, God made sure that he designed us with one thing that is solely designed for pleasure, so you are wrong.
And it has more nerve endings than the penis.
It sure does. It sure does.
So sit on that.
Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Yeah. So yeah, that's if you want. If you go with the intelligent design,
he designed it for a purpose, right? And if that's what it's for, you should make sure it gets it.
Crowning creation.
So there you go. If it's designed that way,
you should use it the way it was designed.
Yes, very much so.
Oh my gosh. So, this, I think we could have gone into a little bit more of detail, and you had kind of a thought about diving into something, but we are almost at an hour and a half now, and it is getting late over there in the Eastern time zone.
Yeah, it's a
So,
lot.
I just, this was such a great topic. I think we could have one of these discussions like every quarter. So, if you're watching this and there were questions that were not answered on this episode or the previous episode, please put them in the comments down below, or you can go and find us on Facebook or Instagram and put it in a comment, send us in a message, and if we get enough questions, we'll have Mark on again.
I
So,
Yeah, anytime, anytime.
oh
Good.
man, guys, I know that this is a really tough topic for us as survivors. This is really hard to
Yes.
navigate. There are so many emotions that go through our minds. There's so many things that each one of us have personal experience with that we bring to the table when we have a relationship, and we're navigating through so many false teachings and discovering what we are, who we want to be, what we find pleasure in, what we want, what we need, all of those things. So, like we said earlier, be kind to yourself, give yourself grace. You were not equipped to deal with these things in your upbringing, most likely. Or if you were like me and joined when you were an adult, you had to repress all the things that you learned before you were in the cult. And now you have to almost like relearn the things you unlearned yourself. Like, I mean, can you like the pathways that have been trained and untrained in my brain are many and vast.
And the only thing is, even if you're getting out or have been out, there are professionals out there that can help you. The thing that is the biggest hurdle is accepting the fact that you're worthy of the help.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Marcy, do you have any closing thoughts?
I think that you guys stated it really clearly. I would say, be brave. Be brave. If you have issues, then be brave enough to reach out to a therapist if you need to. It's not shameful, and it might be a little scary, but it might really help you where you need it. So be brave. This is a hard
And be
topic.
willing and be willing
Yeah.
to try more than one
Mhm.
if the first one
Yes.
doesn't help you.
Yes.
Like with all
Yes.
therapy,
Mhm.
one
Mhm.
size does not fit all, and if one therapist
Mhm.
isn't working for you, go find another one.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you
And
need to wait a while between the trying,
Mhm.
that's fine. Give yourself some time, give yourself some grace, be kind to yourself, and try again. You can always try again.
Yes, and I've mentioned, especially in like educational settings, how to recognize and understand when you have a good therapist and when you have a bad therapist, and what's a good one
Mhm.
for you, and it's okay. So I've done a few of these things of, you know, always have questions. If you're going to a new therapist, always have questions, and that's another
Mhm.
topic I could go on how to find an ethical therapist, how to find the right therapist for you, kind of element too.
Mhm.
So yeah, don't be afraid just because they're experts,
Mhm.
or alleged experts on what you need. Um,
Mhm.
that we're not all one size fits all.
Mhm.
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 And every therapist brings their own experiences into their practice, whether they realize it or not. And so, your our personalities may not fit. So, there's so many factors into finding a good therapist.
Mhm.
So, with that, we just want to thank Mark so much for being here.
Yes.
A wealth of information,
You-
of good advice, and just I really hope that this episode and the previous episode with Mark has helped you in your journey to self-discovery. I do have a few closing thoughts. I'm just going to read this real quick. I read this in our last episode, but if you don't watch both, I want you to hear this.
Mm.
Women and men alike, you are in control of your body, and you have the right to deny even your partner access to it. Boundaries and communication are important to any healthy relationship. Your partner's sexual desires are not a reflection on your worth, value, or your appearance. No is a complete sentence. but communicating the reason you may or may not want sex will help your partner understand where you are. You don't always have to tell the why, but if you feel comfortable doing it, do so. It is important to make a safe space for you and your partner to share your desires and fantasies. I always recommend therapy to those that are struggling with the myriad of challenges that come with leaving the teachings of the cult. It is up to you to determine what is acceptable for your life and no one else. There are always compromises in a relationship, but they should not make you feel guilt, shame, or like you are repressing your true self. You are valuable, you have worth, and no matter what you have been through, no one can take that away.
Yes.
Yep.
And with that, if someone hasn't told you ever or today, we're proud of you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do the closing and we can hang this up for the night.